We begin this presentation by acknowledging that this work has taken place on Binjarrup, Whadjuk and Wudandi Noongar Butja in what is also known as Western Australia. We offer this acknowledgement knowing that it is not the culmination of our responsibilities, rather it's only the beginning, and we're committed to becoming accountable to the complexities and obligations of living in settler colonial spaces.
We also acknowledge our co-researchers, Dr. Annette Nichol and Professor Mindy Blaze, who are key collaborators and co-thinkers in this project. And we also thank the Peel Harvey Catchment Council for its involvement.
The research we share with you today draws from our paper published in Environmental Education Research, titled Extinction, Education and the Curious Practice of Visiting Thrombolites. It is a part of a larger project that involves working towards the design and implementation of ethically and politically attuned relational pedagogies that foster more livable worlds. Brad and I work across fields of childhood studies, education, feminisms, environmental humanities, multi-species studies, extinction studies and new materialisms to conduct research that grapples with the overarching question of what we might learn by paying attention to children's worldly relations.
We walk lightly on the short path towards the boardwalk that takes visitors to the eastern edge of Lake Clifton, or Nuruk Yalgarup as it is known in the local indigenous Binjarrup Noongar language. It is 8 a.m. in the season of Birak, the Noongar first summer. The branches of Melaleuca trees that arch across the path shelter us from the hot morning sun. We pause to marvel at the peppering of shiny black spots that float around us on our walk. These are countless Christmas spiders that have spun large orbed webs across the path, netting small flying insects and humans who weave under and around the latticework. We proceed past the Melaleucas and towards the boardwalk and lake. The clicking of the cicadas and the chirping of the fairy wrens and western whistlers soften, and a vast expanse of glassy water opens before us. Spread across the landscape like an elongated blue iris gazing up to the sky, the lake glows in the light of the ancient sun. The gentle, warm morning breeze is like the lake's breath, inhaling and exhaling, as it has done for thousands of years. Along its eastern edge, the lake cradles thrombolites, which the Binjarrup people call nuruk, or eggs of the woggle, a snake-like dreaming creature, creator and protector of rivers, waterways and landforms. Standing on the wooden boardwalk that elevates us above the water, we look towards these rock-like domes that form a limestone-coloured reef that stretches north and south into the distance along the shallow eastern boundary of the lake. The landscape is an encounter with deep time. While the Lake Clifton thrombolites are estimated to be 2,000 years old, thrombolites have existed on Earth for over 3.5 billion years. The reef of thrombolites at Lake Clifton takes our imaginations to where thrombolites covered vast swathes of the Earth's surface. Despite their lifeless appearance, these so-called living rocks are formed from the activity of microbial communities. This made them pivotal to the evolution of life on Earth billions of years ago, where the photosynthesis of the thrombolite cyanobacteria filled the Earth's atmosphere with oxygen. Having survived multiple planetary extinction events, there are now only a few surviving thrombolite colonies on the planet. Changing Earth systems over millions of years has progressively made thrombolites unviable. The thrombolites at Lake Clifton are now critically endangered, a status exacerbated by increased salinity, decreased rainfall, land clearing and pollutants from surrounding areas.
Provoked by these unique thrombolites of Lake Clifton and the onrushing rate of worldwide species extinction, we set out to explore new ways of approaching extinction in education. We did this because education systems and educators must face up to anthropogenic ecological disruption, including extinction, so that current and future generations can grapple with the very present ecological uncertainty and precarity. Extinction is commonly understood and taught to children through the discourses of science, particularly the biological sciences, where children may learn of the loss of individual species because of their failure to adapt, or hear stories of historical loss of dinosaurs and exotic species like the dodo. For our project, we asked how we could approach extinction differently in education. What if we took children into a critically endangered ecosystem where extinction was making itself apparent? What concepts and ideas could help us generate pedagogical insights into teaching children in the face of unprecedented disruption and to the destruction of orders of life that sustain the living?
To explore these issues, we turn to the environmental humanities and the interdisciplinary fields of multi-species studies and extinction studies. Our aim was to assemble concepts and ideas from the humanities with scientific understandings of ecological precarity, extinction, and the thrombolites. Extinction studies and multi-species studies helps us to recognise that extinction is more than a scientific story. Rather, it is a story of colonisation, a story of human industrialisation, of land clearing and agriculture, of wealth generation, inequality and globalisation. It is a story of pollution, a story of the effects of the hubris of human mastery, superiority and human exceptionalism. And it is the catastrophic story of human-induced climate breakdown. Extinction in particular is a story of the unravelling of life, of the interdependencies of multiple species that have come to depend on each other. Deborah Bird Rose characterises this as the unravelling of the knots of embodied time. By this, Rose means the severing of generational biocultural inheritances breathed across generations, as well as the destruction of the webs of multi-species relations and encounters that nourish individuals and species through the duration of lives. Extinction, therefore, is the unravelling and disruption of these life-giving orders that we all embody. It is with these sensibilities that our project developed.
In January 2020, we visited the thrombolites with 51 invited 2 to 12-year-old children in a series of 5 visits. Also present on various occasions were an artist, a bird watcher and various scientists. Our aim was to explore how bringing children into an extinction event in their local area within the framework of curiosity, openness and attentiveness might generate pedagogical insights for educators. Following Donna Haraway and Vincent Desprez, we call this approach to visiting as researchers and as educators a curious practice. Visiting as a curious practice avoids the functional sense of visiting as a practice for achieving predetermined and specified ends. For example, we did not set out to fill the children with preordained facts about thrombolites, nor did we seek to apply and test a pedagogical model. Our ethos was to be open and curious as both educators and researchers. We listened, observed, conversed and thought together. Following our visits, we wrote of our encounters with the children and thrombolites by weaving together scientific knowledge, cultural criticism and the aesthetic of storytelling. We storied our observations and encounters and created a blog site for these stories.
We did this storytelling partly because, as multi-species and extinction studies scholars recognise, stories can help us to grapple with what an extinction means and why it matters and to whom. There are many stories and perspectives in a single extinction event. Hence we aim to recognise the stories of land clearing, pollution and climate change, to tell the story of the interdependence between the species of Lake Clifton, and to tell the story of the folly of human exceptionalism and what extinction and the loss of the thrombolites might mean for young children and for educators. As researchers, we used our storytelling as a tool to think through pedagogies for learning and living with the ecological crises of our shared world. We hoped that adding life to the cold numbers that can characterise science stories of ecological precarity and decline might better represent the complex relations, histories and stories of this place, and draw readers into the new ways of knowing and new relations of responsibility and care. So now, we share some stories about our use of the curious practice of visiting.
We gather in a car park on the edge of Lake Clifton with a group of young children and their carers who are all encountering the lake and these rocky formations for the first time. We make our way from the car park through the lake's bushy fringe and approach the boardwalk. Oh, look, it's a sea, it's a beach. 3-year-old Anna spots the water through the trees and dashes toward it along the boardwalk. As she reaches the thrombolites, she suddenly stops and exclaims excitedly, "Meatballs! Spaghetti and meatballs!" While we've often heard the thrombolites referred to as rocks, this is the first time we've heard them called meatballs. We don't know if Anna thinks thrombolites really are meatballs, and it would be easy to simply dismiss her naming of thrombolites as meatballs as a naive substitution in the face of the lack of another word. But we wonder if thinking about thrombolites as meatballs helps Anna and us to think differently about thrombolites and their environment. "It's hot," says Anna, looking at the giant meatballs below her. It is indeed an uncomfortably warm day, and the group is more than ready to head for the shade of the tuits on the edge of the lake. "Do you think the thrombolites like it hot?" asks Anna's mother. "Meatballs like it hot," Anna replies. We've come to this research informed by the pedagogical research practices of the educational project of Reggio Emilia in Italy, practices that call us to listen to children with openness and without preconceived ideas about what is right. Listening to young children with openness then is part of our curious practice. We're curious to know where thinking of thrombolites as meatballs might take Anna and us. So we resist our urge to tell her that thrombolites are not meatballs, because we know from previous experience that doing so would risk quelling her enthusiasm for this moment. Instead, we ask if she'd like to draw what she can see in the notebook we've given her. Anna takes this invitation very seriously. As we watch Anna gazing intently at the thrombolite meatballs, we notice it is not just her eyes that are doing the sensing. Her whole body seems to be alive to her surroundings. Her attentiveness in this new situation is palpable. We notice other children are similarly alive to their surroundings as they sit and lie on the boardwalk, peering through railings and gaps in the boards. None of them scoff at Anna's meatball theory. We researchers wonder later if in fact it offered them another way of encountering the thrombolites. After all, we cook meat to kill the microbes in it. So we decide to use this story to help children and adults imagine thrombolites, which are complex microbial communities, as slowly poaching in the increasingly saline and warming waters of this lake. In describing Dupre's curious practice in her animal studies work, Haraway notes that Dupre, and I quote, trains her whole being, not just her imagination, to go visiting, end of quote. So as adults and educators, we may need to train ourselves to go visiting using all of our senses. But like Dupre, when Anna, who is 3 years old, encounters the thrombolites, she is visiting with her imagination and her whole being. She doesn't need any training. Anna is teaching us the art of curious practice. And she reminds us that as adults who work with young children, if we're to cultivate what Haraway calls the wild virtue of curiosity, we need to be careful not to rush children into separating fact from fiction. Two-year-old Max is very excited by the thrombolite water assemblage that lies before and beneath him. He rushes along the boardwalk, dashing from one side to the other. "Oh!" Max exclaims, pointing excitedly towards the water before rushing off again. "Look! Oh! Look!" His father, Josh, valiantly tries to stay in close proximity. Even though the water is less than 1.5 metres deep, Josh knows that water and young children can be a dangerous combination. His concern is obvious, and several times he grabs the back of Max's shirt as he leans perilously over the edge of the boardwalk. As we watch Max's exuberant interactions with the thrombolites as he lurches from danger to safety to danger again, we're reminded not just of his vulnerability, but also the vulnerability of these thrombolites and the precariousness of the whole thrombolite assemblage, of which humans are a part. Max's safety is ensured by his father's vigilant presence, but it would not take much to change the situation. Other children have drowned in this lake. Thrombolites are complex microbial communities, but they do not live in isolation. They are situated in entangled relations of water, land, rocks, trees and reeds, to name but a few. The holding togetherness of these thrombolites depends on all of these. Max's falling into the lake might be frighteningly rapid, but the thrombolite assemblage is equally precarious, albeit within different temporalities. In other nearby lakes, thrombolite assemblages have succumbed to the complex interactions of a threatened and fragmented ecosystem. Forests and wetlands have been replaced by houses and pavement, fresh aquifers suck in seawater rather than recharge with rain, and changing lacustrine nutrient loads favour other photosynthetic microbes. Like Max, thrombolites are dependent on those around them. Like thrombolites, we're all dependent on those around us, human and non-human. As Anna Singh notes, precarity is the condition of being vulnerable to others. Unpredictable encounters transform us. We are not in control, even of ourselves.
Here's the final story. Making sense of where he is, 8-year-old Charlie eagerly shares with us his impressive knowledge of the geological and biological history of planet Earth, stretching back to its molten past. He's attentive to how the thrombolites came to be in the story of the ancient Earth. I say to Charlie, these thrombolites have been here for around 2,000 years, but thrombolites have been around for over 3 billion years. That's a long time. We don't know how long they will live for, or if they will die soon. The water may be becoming too salty. My words are an invitation to think through another temporal frame by bringing to mind imaginings of the yet-to-become of the thrombolites as they approach the edge of extinction. And for Charlie, the death of the thrombolites matters. He says to me, I hope they don't die until after I die. I'd bring my child here too. Charlie here thinks about his future. Thinking with different temporal frames enables the exploration of our accountability in terms of our inheritances and our legacies and how we could live differently. Multi-species studies provokes us to find ways to live in situations of precarity and destruction, and to look for what Haraway says is the ongoing practices of living in the ruins, to explore the ruins that have become our collective homes. And perhaps care is a part of this process. I ask Charlie, why should we care about thrombolites? My question emanates from my curiosity about how humans can cultivate care for entities that don't appear affiliated to us, useful or sensible. Charlie ponders and then responds with, we should care because they are so old. Because they make oxygen, says another child listening in. The children's responses echo in our ears as we ponder how humans can make kin with their earth others. In response to this conversation about caring for thrombolites, one child says, we could take stuff out of the water, like the hats, thongs and rubbish. And another child comments, by not putting rubbish in the water and not stepping on them. One of my friends lives near. She comes here to check on them. It's interesting because the children do not offer grandiose ideas or plans, and they avoid instating the human as the master, the caretaker, or the steward of the earth. Instead, they offer modest, tangible,
and situated ways in which humans can live in this place, respectful of the lives of thrombolites and our relationships with them.
Onrushing extinctions and ecological precarity should compel us to forge new ways of living with a damaged planet. Haraway calls for us not to look away, but to stay with the trouble. Haraway's call is an invitation to discover and invent new sensibilities, concepts and practices for living with our non-natal kin, for multi-species flourishing on a planet desperately needing new ways of thinking and living. There is an important role here for education. Thinking pedagogically, visiting thrombolites with politeness, attentiveness and curiosity departed from more conventional pedagogies that focus on imparting knowledge and learning about things like thrombolites as specimens and extinction as a biological fact. The curious practice we adopted invited ourselves and the children to encounter the thrombolites as polite, inquisitive, attentive and imaginative visitors of others' worlds. As researchers, we politely observed and interacted with the children as they wondered, speculated about and storied themselves into the worlds and lives of the thrombolites, including their shared futures. To generate pedagogies around building young children's relationships with non-human worlds and ecological processes, we need to be attentive to rather than overlook children. We need to listen and think with them with openness and curiosity to enable their and our curious practice. This, we suggest, is one way to make possible new relations and potentialities for both children and endangered ecosystems and species.